Okay. Welcome everybody. This morning we're going to be going over the WFDS Next Gen, or just WFDS now, overview of strategy and spatial fire planning. My name's Sam Amato. I work with the WFM RD&A. In fact, let me turn my camera on real quick, just so we can do some intros. And I'm one of the product owners here at the WFM RD&A that helps put together WFDS. So today I'm going to go through a crosswalk of how WFDS Next Gen is handling spatial fire planning data, and then also the differences and similarities of strategy in WFDS. And this is going to be a broader overview for the next hour, and then we're going to dive in on strategic assessments or objectives and requirements, and we'll also go over course of action. Okay, I'm going to shut off my camera, and we'll just dive right in. A bunch of the other RD&A folks are on as well, so if you have questions, just throw them in the chat, and we'll try and answer them as we go. Oh, sorry, let me switch to presentation mode. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to go over is kind of a comparison of how spatial fire planning is handled in WFDS Classic and WFDS Next Gen. So one big difference is that spatial fire planning data used to be housed inside WFDS Classic. So what that meant was that, a couple times a year we would do updates of the spatial fire planning data, and that we were dependent on the WFM-RD&A data staff to do those updates for you guys and get them loaded into the system, make sure everything was working properly. And then if there were any errors or problems, you'd have to work with the RD&A data staff to get those resolved. But it was kind of a one and done thing per year. In WFDS Next Gen, what we wanted to do is make that a little bit more dynamic and allow the field to make edits more on their own schedule and to give them more ownership of their spatial fire planning data. So a lot of hard work from Wes and the data shop, Susan, Jonah, and Amanda, and we got the spatial fire planning service set up. So that acts as a service. So WFDS Next Gen doesn't necessarily house the spatial fire planning data. It's housed at the spatial fire planning service through NIFC AGOL, and then we consume it as a service. So if you were to update your spatial fire planning data this morning and you had a fire this afternoon, when you had that fire and you started a decision, you'd have the data that you updated just this morning. So it's a lot more on demand. The other thing is how we are using spatial fire planning data in WFDS. So in Classic, you have to have a strategic objective or an FMU code language inside your decision. That's the requirement. In WFDS Next Gen, you don't have to have it. If you do have it, we'll include it in the appendix. But we bring all of your spatial fire planning data in, and then we clip it by the planning area, which allows you to build your objectives and requirements and your course of action on top of your spatial fire planning data and kind of tier it to each other. So in WFDS Classic, it was a requirement. If your planning area, your POO, didn't have any SO or FMU language there, you'd have to pick some to put in there. And for us, it's optional. So if you want to use a pod for your course of action, or you want to use some other shape, let's say you work for a state or a local municipality and you still want to use WFDS, you can do that. And you don't necessarily have to have spatial fire planning data. And then in the Classic decision, spatial fire planning inventory came into your decision. That was added by default into your decision. And we are also clipping spatial fire planning data in the spatial inventory that we do in an automated way as well. So that's also a default. And then again, we don't force you to use spatial fire planning data in NextGen, but if it is clipped, we will add it into the decision in an appendix. Okay. So here's some, just to review some of the differences and those implications. Again, it's optional. This is kind of a line-by-line workflow of how you go through a decision. And each of these, each of these sections that's marked in yellow is something that, oh, somebody have something? Somebody might have a hot mic.
I just wanted to go over some time stuff.
Okay, so each of these boxes here that are marked with yellow are items that are coming soon or that differ from how they're done in Classic. So your incident information, right now we're not automatically capturing your incident information and a map. That's coming soon. I'm not sure which release that'll be in or if it'll be in a release this year, but we will try and get all the incident information. I'm just not sure about the map template. That might require an upgrade of some GIS. The planning area in WFDS NextGen is automated. So as soon as you start a decision, a planning area is created for you. And that planning area is then used to clip spatial data. And you get what's called a spatial inventory, same as a values inventory, basically. And that's automated, and your spatial fire planning data is actually in that spatial inventory. The part that's coming soon is we're hoping to allow people to actually do spatial inventories by some of their spatial fire planning data and other shapes throughout the year. So all you can do a spatial inventory by right now is a planning area and a landscape extent. But we are working on some other shapes that you'll be able to do spatial inventories with. The other place that spatial fire planning data is going to have some implications is, of course, in the objective section over here, where it's optional, and then your course of action, where we allow you now to use your spatial fire planning data to tier your course of action to it. This is the part I was going to just jump into the application real quick. So while I do that, are there any questions on spatial fire planning as I get in here and show you some of the touch points? Okay. So the first place you're going to have access to your spatial fire planning data is in the map as a reference layer. We have a release coming out pretty soon, and it's going to actually be updating some of the names of these layers. I'm going to zoom in on Alexander Mountain, which is a fire from last year, and the Arapahoe Roosevelt, and we'll display some of the spatial fire planning data. So this is all the spatial fire planning data, and I'll go through each shape type for those of you who haven't been in the know on this. So we have a few different classes. Subunit overlapping shapes are basically equivalent to what used to be called management requirements. I'll show you how those are pulled in, but those are shapes that overlap. So, this is land and resource management plan information that could be things like wildlife habitat or watersheds that need protecting, sensitive cultural areas, things like that, that you may want to bring into your decision and use to build objectives and requirements on top of. Then you have the subunit non-overlapping shapes. So these are distinct shapes on the Arapahoe Roosevelt. They use these shapes to determine response type. And I'll show you how we can look at some of that data later on. Um, this is probably going to be the most applicable to strategic objectives from Classic. Then you have your unit boundary. So this would be most similar to an FMU, but this is a unit level, so it's clipped to unit boundaries. Um, we allow you to use those as well. And then we have multi-unit shapes as well. These are things like Alaska fire management options, or if you have some ways you're going to manage fire, some requirements and objectives with neighbors, you've done some cross-border coordination, you might want to use these shapes as well. And this will include overlapping and non-overlapping shapes, depending on where you're at. And then we also added other unit shapes. So we have the points, lines, and polygons, and those are in here as well. Okay, so how this data is then pulled into your decision. So I kind of cheated and I've been working in Alexander Mountain here with Sarah, and the decision's already been started. But if this was a brand new decision and I came in here, this would say start decision instead of decision. I'd click on that button and it's going to take me into the decision for this incident. So when I started that decision, if this was a new incident, it's going to create a default planning area that's 7 miles by 7 miles. And it's going to go through and it's going to clip all the spatial fire planning data. And then it's going to pull that data into the spatial inventory, and it's going to pull that information into your Appendix A when you publish. It's also going to pull it into the strategy tab here, namely on the strategic assessment tab and on the strategic course of action. Let me just turn off some of these layers here to deep busy the map real quick. Okay, I'm going to turn off all the strategic assessment course of action for now. Let me turn off all my planning data. Okay, so this is the initial planning area, this dotted purple line here. And I am going to turn on what got clipped so that you can see that. I'm going to turn off the user defined. Okay, so these are all the shape classes that got clipped. And where you're going to see those is if you come in here to create a new strategic assessment, you would see all those different classes. So here's the multi-unit. If there was anything in this class, it would pull up in feature name. This unit doesn't have any. The only shape that's in the unit non-overlapping shapes is the Arapahoe Roosevelt. So this clipped right out of the unit boundary with their new planning area. This is the one that was drawn here. Center that up for you. So here's the boundary of the Arapahoe Roosevelt. You can see this planning area goes a little bit onto private state. And then if I were to pull up subunit non-overlapping, what would have been strategic objective shapes? Here are those shapes, and here's the language that's in the Spatial Fire Planning Service associated with that shape. So you won't need to reference this language. You won't need to recreate it. It's going to automatically be added into this strategic assessment, but then you can build on that language if you need to. Here's your subunit overlapping shapes, and we have several of those inside the planning area. We have some wilderness stuff, it looks like, some protection areas, and some cooperation areas. Probably sit outside the boundary there. And the other thing that comes in here, let's see if they've got any other unit shapes. They do. Here's some CWPP priority areas. So these would be really useful if you're doing strategic assessments. These are CWPP priority areas, so odds are these are protection objective because this is a community here. And so you might want to build strategy and objectives in such a way that you're protecting those values at risk. They also have some lynx habitat in here and some old growth. And so you're able to build on this spatial fire planning data in both areas. And for your course of action and for your objectives, the lists are the same. Questions on that as I jump back into the presentation part? I'm going to rehash some of that strategy stuff if you didn't catch it all. Oswaldo, go ahead.
Yeah, I do have a question. If you can flip back to
Yeah.
the other tab. Yeah, so I was wondering about when you go back to strategic assessment, you didn't go through the process, but I guess it's pretty intuitive where you add or include indecision or highlight indecision or critical
Oh,
values at risk. That's
we'll
later
do a
on.
whole unit on that.
Okay, thank you.
We're going to spend a big chunk of time on that in a little bit. Um, so I can walk through that whole thing. But do you
Appreciate
have
it. Thank
a
you.
particular question on the spatial fire planning data?
No.
Okay. Um, yeah, I'll do broad stroke over the strategy right now, and then I'm going to dive into strategic assessment and course of action separately. And I think we've got time lined out all the way up till noon to do that, till 12:30. So we'll be able to really get in the weeds. Any other questions on spatial fire planning? Curious why the default isn't for all shapes and associated text clip by planning area be activated, turned on, and the user could turn off any they don't apply to the decision. So we're going to include everything that it clips in Appendix A, and we kind of went the opposite way, Casey, where everything is on. Everything's going to be included in your decision. This just gives you a chance to build upon those if you need to elaborate. If you don't need to elaborate on anything that got clipped and is going to go into your decision as spatial fire planning data, then you can just skip that altogether and do, you know, public and firefighter safety objective, and don't worry about the spatial fire planning data at all in this part.
Okay, thanks.
So this is just a recap of spatial fire planning data. Oh, sorry. Let's see, Molly has a question. Okay, so if you see something that's not correct with the data or verbiage, how do you change that language or who do you reach out to? So that would be the folks that would have been data managers in WFDS Classic. So odds are that's going to be your fire planner, and they will have access and roles to the spatial fire planning service. And Wes, did you want to touch on that at all?
Yeah,
Well,
I
it
can
sounds
a
like
little bit. So I added the link to the spatial fire planning service in the chat there. For those of you that may have been previous data managers, you should already be data managers within the spatial fire planning service, but you do have to have a NIFC AGL login. And I'll send the link to that group to get access to be a data manager. And then if you can't get a hold of a local data manager, you can always reach out to your geographic area editor, your GAE, and they can kind of point you in the right direction.
And I just put a link in here for constant contact for the spatial fire planning service. And if you're interested in getting newsletters or communications from Spatial Fire Planning Service, you can opt into that. And I believe that has links to, well, let's just pull it up. I believe that has links to the office hours for Spatial Fire Planning Service as well, which is a great resource if you have questions or would like to keep up to speed on the Spatial Fire Planning Service. So there's a ton of information here. If you have any questions on this, I would definitely get signed up for this constant contact. And I believe our office hours for Spatial Fire Planning Service are also recorded. So if you need to get access to any of those, you'll be able to do that too. Okay, quick recap on spatial fire planning data. And again, quick overview. So if you guys have questions, please bring them up. We have a whole hour to talk about this stuff. So spatial fire planning data has been moved out of WFDS and is now in its own service. The roles were pretty much moved over to the Spatial Fire Planning Service. And if you have questions on those, you can pop into the office hours or you could ask them here. And then we are querying that data by the automated planning area to start. If you happen to draw a planning area after that, you can generate a new spatial inventory and we'll re-query. So for Molly's example, let's say you start a fire, it comes in with the initial planning area, it happens to clip some of your spatial fire planning data, it's incorrect, verbiage or shapes or whatever, and then you go to your fire planner and you get that fixed, and now you want to see the updated language in there. You could redraw the square or put in a different planning area, or really just re-query, regenerate a spatial inventory, and we'll go out, we'll reclip your spatial fire planning data, and then your corrections will be in the system. Strategic assessments and courses of action can be tied and built upon your spatial fire planning data. So you'll be able to tie those things together. Huh? Go ahead. Oh, maybe that was just a hot mic. And then, as I mentioned, we're going to have near real-time updates of that spatial fire planning data. So a lot more control if you have incorrect language or shapes that you don't want in your decision. And then, of course, we're going to be automatically adding that to Appendix A, similar to how it was automatically added to the objective section in Classic. Okay, now I'm going to jump into kind of broad stroke stuff with strategy, unless there's any more questions on spatial fire planning. I don't see any. So the decision workflow in WFDS NextGen. The decision workflow is pretty much the same as it was in Classic. We're still using the risk-informed decision process. All the major components are there. The main difference is that we've put them in the interface in a much more linear fashion. So if you haven't been in there in a while, it should be pretty clear. If you just keep going left to right and top to bottom, you'll hit everything that's required in your decision. And you can do a decision relatively quickly. There are a couple differences. There's some extra automated inventory stuff coming in the 1.1 release. There's a weather narrative section that we're going to be putting in the 1.1 release. That's not going to be like default like it was in Classic, but it'll give you the ability to put your weather forecast or any weather data in your decision in a distinct spot for weather. And then incident information, we're working on getting that map in there, but I'm not sure we're going to be able to get it in the 1.1 release. We'll see how that goes. Might be dependent on some GIS upgrades. The modeling section or analysis section in WFDS NextGen, that used to be optional and now it's a requirement. You need to fill that out even if it's just to check a box and say, I'm not going to include any analysis in my decision. And at some point this year, we're going to attempt to get some automated fire behavior analysis done so that you'll have analysis right off the bat when you start your decision that you can use in that section too. These were previously default populated, so you would get your spatial fire planning data default populated into the objectives section if you had it. And now you need to manually put that in. So for weather and for the strategic assessment, you're going to be responsible for creating at least one strategic assessment. Doesn't necessarily have to be based on spatial fire planning, but you have to have one strategic assessment, whether that's an objective, a requirement, a protection objective, whatever you want it to be, needs to go into the decision. And then we do have a modified requirement with the rationale. Rationale needs to be completed by the approvers. It's part of the approval process. And lastly, the assessment is now semi-optional. So if you are publishing a decision and you're pretty sure you're going to catch the fire or the fire's been caught and you're not going to need any more periodic assessments, but maybe you're not going to declare the fire out, you can mark the strategy has been met in your assessment time periods, and you won't get reminded about doing any more assessments. I will also mention notifications aren't going to be active probably for this whole fire season. So we're used to get a lot of notifications for decisions ready for approval or periodic assessments are due. That won't be happening this summer. You're going to have to just stay on top of that stuff manually. We weren't able to get that done for the 1.0 release this spring. Okay. I will pop into Wooftus and we can take a quick look around. Okay, so strategy, and we touched on a little bit in strategic assessment, but strategy stepper is basically composed of 3 parts in Wooftus Next Gen. You have the strategic assessment, which is equivalent to the objectives and requirements section of Wooftus Classic. And the reason we called it strategic assessments is there's a couple additional parts in here that I will briefly go over and we'll dive into detail later, but you can add categories to these beyond just objectives and requirements. So you have the objectives, requirements, you can tag things as a miss tactic or safety concern or suppression repair, something else beyond just an objective and requirement. And then, as I mentioned, you can build that on top of your spatial fire planning data. And then course of action. Course of action is a lot more explicit in Wooftus Next Gen. And again, we'll dive into this more later, but we've broken it out into several different fields so that decision makers can be pretty explicit about what the course of action is, what the current fire situation, so why are we doing what we're doing right now, and what do we want this to look like. And then strategic comparison is something that was kind of a compromise between moving back toward alternatives. So it's a fast way to document your logic on why you chose a particular course of action, a particular strategy versus others. And then in this section, in course of action, we also allow you to optionally attach a NWCG strategy and report it to Irwin if you want to. If you don't, you can always mark it as not defined. And then we put cost inside the strategy tab as well. It's not necessarily part of your strategy, but it was a good spot to put it. And by the time you reach this point of your decision, you should have a pretty good idea of what you're going to do on the fire. And then you can take a a pretty good estimate of what the final cost is going to be. And we give you a couple different ways to assess that. You have your old NWCG cost spreadsheet that was in Classic, and you also have the ISAP cost estimator, which we're going to update yearly. I believe this has already been updated this year. One big difference in cost to note over Classic is that there is no more SCI. So that tool has been deprecated, and we're working on a new cost tool, but there is none in here right now. And I will also note this is just a placeholder. In a release that's coming out this week or next, you'll see this just go to NA. Eventually, this will be hooked up to Irwin, and we'll give you the Irwin cost to date so you can see what's in Irwin before you estimate your final cost. So you can make sure that your cost is more than the estimated cost to date. And that is a quick overview of the strategy. I will mention, and we'll go over this when we get to cost course of action rather later today, but strategy slider has been in WFDS Classic for quite a while. It was optional, and what we did in NextGen is we took that slider, we made it a drop down, aligned those values with the 209 so that we're using the same words to talk to each other. But it is still optional. You don't have to do it. You will have to make a note, and that's your course of action. So it's not really your strategy note that's mandatory, but you do have to speak to what you're going to be doing on the fire in your course of action. And then, of course, rationale must be completed by the approver. And the biggest difference between Classic and NextGen is everything has to be spatially explicit. And in Classic, this was implied. If you're doing something on your fire, the implication is it applies to that planning area. We had a couple options to weigh when we were developing the system of doing things two separate ways, spatially and non-spatially. And eventually it came down to the lowest level of effort was to make everything spatial and just allow users the ability to mark their planning area as the shape associated with a course of action or an objective. So everything is spatially explicit in WFDS NextGen. And then a couple enhancements to mention. The planning area being automated. Again, you don't have to use that if you don't want to, but by automating that planning area, we can clip your spatial fire planning data, and then we can use it to make a values inventory or a spatial inventory and get that to the decision maker immediately. And if you would like to do that, you can do multiple non-overlapping courses of action. You can report distinct strategies. So if you have several different strategies you want to manage your fire with, you can report those to Irwin or not. And you can mark assessments as strategies been met and basically turn off periodic assessments for fires that are perhaps caught but not out due to considerations of, suppression repair or budgetary constraints, or maybe there's a cost share agreement with the state that needs to be worked out before you can call the fire out. So you can kind of turn off those periodic assessments. That is the broad stroke overview I had. Are there any questions on strategy generally?
Hey Sam, it's Molly. I I know I asked this question yesterday, and Wes,
Sure.
you can correct me if this is not again the right place for it, but I know you mentioned there's a button you can check in a strategy that is defer to the 209, don't defer to the 209. Can you elaborate a little bit more on when that's appropriate or the things to think about when you're checking that box? And if this isn't the right one, I can hold that question till later as well.
We
I
can
think
talk about it now, and we can
okay.
discuss it later as well. I'm not sure how people are going to consume these sessions once they're recorded, but we can talk about that right now. So in the course of action, if you choose to use one of these strategies, like full suppression here, so in the Alexander fire, I believe Sarah has some course of action in here. She does. And so you've got these two courses of actions here. I'll update the table real quick, and then I'll scroll up and show you what that looks like. When it's appropriate to report that to Irwin, I would say if you have a complex incident and you're trying to be clear and transparent and make sure there's no miscommunications between various stakeholders, the IMT, and the decision maker, I would probably do it then. The reason this came into being is there was a tool that we used to do manually called the Management Direction Alignment Tool. And I believe that was used in 2017, 2018, maybe even a little bit in 2019. But the intent of the tool was to show where we had these miscommunications between systems because there was a lot of confusion about how a particular incident was being managed, and things were being reported differently between WFDS and the 209, and it was causing confusion about how things were being managed on the fire. So in your course of action, if you don't want to report to the 209 and it's checked by default, we won't push your strategy when you publish your decision out to Irwin. If you do decide to click that button, we will push those values to Irwin, and any downstream systems will read those values. What those values are is up to you to populate. And we give you a couple different breakdowns of how your strategy is calculated. This one didn't get calculated with a perimeter. So if I took this perimeter here and requeried, oh no, it did do it by the perimeter. So 89% of the burned area is in full suppression. 10% of the burned area, my actual perimeter, is point protection. So if this was me, I would probably report these burned area values versus planning area. But I think it depends on context and how you do stuff in your agency and in your region, and what the direction is from upper level leadership. Probably more of concern is actually how you're managing the actual fire, which is this clip of your perimeter over your strategies. So in case you wanted to do it on this one, you would report, 87%, maybe 90 even on your full suppression and 10 on your point zone. And if you populated this and then you went ahead and published, these are the numbers that would get sent to Irwin. And what we will do when we get this connected to Irwin as well is we're going to pull these values from Irwin. So if 209's already been reporting a breakdown of strategy, we'll pull those numbers in so you can see what they are. And if you just want to defer to the 209 and you're sure there's not going to be any communication problems or nobody's confused on what's going on, you could always just turn this off and just don't worry about the reporting to Irwin. Does that help, Molly? Okay. Ricky, go ahead.
Yeah, and does that push happen when you hit save, or is that happening
No,
with publication?
publication.
All right.
Everything in your decision will get pushed to Irwin on publication. That includes your relative risk, your OA, anything you put in here, any data fields we exchange with Irwin, it's on publication.
Hey, hey Richie. The the one exception there is so if you are entering values, same as absolutely right. It'll go when you hit publish. Um, but if you're checking that box that says don't report strategy, defer to the 209, it will immediately unlock those values if Wooftus is locking 209 out of them. So if you have some values that you've put in and have published, and then you decide, no, we're going to let the 209 handle these, as soon as you check that box, it will unlock it without you having to publish another decision just for that.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about like trying to stay conscious. Like if you do have it so that you are reporting it, and 209 strategies are being updated, there just has to be some coordination between the agency administrator publishing it and not wanting to overwrite it. If that isn't a deliberate act, it's because, yeah, does that make sense? Like
Yeah,
somebody could
Yep,
for
inadvertently
sure.
be overwriting 209 updates when they don't want to just because they're publishing an update and this section might not have been updated.
yep. That was kind of part of our reason for putting in the showing who reported it last and what they said. So absolutely, good call. And Jennifer, to your question, uh, Wooftus is considered, yeah, a more authoritative source, so it would overwrite those values.
For Rick or for Sam, Kevin, and
Sure.
Northops,
Hey.
question just a little more. Maybe we're gonna get into this later, and we're getting into the weeds now. But I heard Rick say that if that if this box in your Wooftus decision is checked to feed to Irwin for strategies, it will lock the 209 out of being able to update strategy. Is that live the same way unlocking it is? You don't have to publish to stop the 209. Like, I guess that's that connection between those two and that order of operation seems really important for us to all understand. And I'm not sure
Right.
it's clear in my head. So
So Wooftus will not send any new values to Irwin, um, and will not essentially put that lock on those values until you publish a decision. Does that get at your question, Kevin?
it does, and then you can take that lock off without publishing a decision.
Correct.
But you can't put that lock on until you publish.
Yep.
Okay.
And then once you started a new, if you had to start a new decision, then it resets that lock, right?
I couldn't quite hear all of that question. Could you repeat it one more time, Chuck?
I was asking, so you publish your decision and now it's locked, this 209 inter relationship that we're talking about here. And then once you start if you have to start a new decision, that completely removes that lock and you're starting fresh on the new decision, right? It doesn't.
Negative. So there is, and Wes will talk more about this when he gets to decision approval, but there's kind of no such thing as starting a new decision. Um, it's just going to be going through the material that you had gotten before, your strategic assessment, relative risk, whatever, and updating those sections and going back to publish. So there's really not a clean slate new decision like I think you're describing. So no, if you publish and essentially lock those values, they would remain that way until you came in here and checked the box not to report them.
Ooh, okay.
I think that was Jennifer's question as well.
That answers. Thanks.
I guess it's important to highlight that the Red Book states that the agency administrator is responsible for the incident strategy. So it's appropriate for WFDS to have a higher ADS in this realm and push the strategy by percent versus the incident management team through their 209 reporting the strategy. Understand that there needs to be conversation there, and that this box is really intended to develop that conversation as we're going to planning meetings and such, to have a transparent conversation on incident strategy and create that alignment where in the past there's been a little bit of misalignment between what's been reported in the WFDS versus what the IMT is reporting in the 209.
Hey, Wes, I think that's a really critical point for everyone to understand and help disseminate both to their agency administrators and to the IMTs. This has a lot of similarities to ISAP in the sense that we're driving agency administrators into taking on the appropriate level of risk and responsibility that in the past perhaps they haven't. And so it's one, going to be a surprise to some AAs, and two, it might feel like things are being taken away from IMTs. So I think we all need to be prepared for both of those realities as we move towards this, but I do think it is super appropriate.
Absolutely. And Scott, Chris, did you still have a question?
Yeah, I guess don't need to raise my hand anymore. And now I got to think of what it was. Oh, yeah. So there are some agency administrators who absolutely want to write their own course of action and rationale, and then some kind of want you to take a stab at it and they'll wordsmith it, right? So if only the approvers can do that now, would a workaround, if they still don't want to do it, be change the approver and then change it back after you've entered it?
Yeah, you could do. But it would just be for the rationale, Scott, not for the course of action. Course of action, any collaborator can edit a course of action.
Okay.
It's just the rationale. And Wes will dive into that when we go through the approval as well. Show you guys all the approvers and how you get those set up and how it works now and how we're where we're headed with approval in a release pretty soon, we hope.
Okay.
So,
and the other question I had, if I could get to, the percentages of strategy, is that something you input directly, or is it calculated some kind of, GIS processing based on your spatial fire planning
These
data?
values are calculated, Scott. So like these charts and everything up here, this is all geospatially calculated. So these values that you see up here in the summary, this is all calculated based on your shapes down here.
Okay.
And so the way this list works is the order of this list matters, top to bottom, and we'll talk about that when we get to course of action. But when you do that and then you update this table, what it's doing is it's doing all those calculations while the spinner is spinning. And then it'll update that table up on top. So if you were to add a new course of action with a new strategy, this one refreshed. So now that changed most of my planning area to full suppression and basically all of the area that the fire is within to full suppression just by swapping the place of those two shapes. And then what you report here, this is 100% user entered. This is not calculated for you. You have to decide this.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay. Any other questions? All right, we'll dive more into strategic assessment and course of action here in a few minutes. So let's take a quick break and we will come back at, I believe, 10:30. Let me check the agenda.
That's right, Sam, 10:30.